Welcome to the Magical Mystery Trip. I'm Ben Fong Torres. The Beatles always enjoyed making movies as well as music. In the mid-60s, well before camcorders, all they had were 8mm home movie cameras, but they made the most of them. What you're about to see is the only private home movie footage of the Beatles ever made available to the public, and on a limited edition basis at that. They came from the estate of Mel Evans, close confidant, road manager, and even occasional backup voice in Beatles sessions. The footage was shot by both Mel and Paul McCartney, and being home movies will be unsteady at times. But they provide glimpses of everyday life and of Paul's vacations in Los Angeles, Denver, Spain, and Africa. We also go on location for the Beatles' TV film Magical Mystery Tour. It was broadcast originally in black and white in December of 1967 in England. It got mixed reviews, but they improved when the film was shown again in color. You'll see never-before-released, behind-the-scenes footage shot on the west coast of England. But we begin with Paul and Mel en route to Denver. It's April 1967, and Paul is preparing to fly from San Francisco to Denver in a Learjet belonging to NBC News. It was Beatles manager Brian Epstein who arranged to get Paul and Mel on board. Before takeoff, Paul captures Mel on film. But it's Paul that the camera and most people seek out, and he accommodates his fellow passengers. Paul is winging his way to Colorado to see his girlfriend, the actress Jane Asher. They had met in 1963. Now, she was the Bristol Old Vics leading ingenue touring with the troupe in its production of Romeo and Juliet. On arrival in Denver, Paul shows off some of the fashion of the day. Then, spotting a liftoff, he puts his movie camera right to work and grabs a last shot of the Learjet. The Beatles had worked nearly 4 months recording Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band, a title, by the way, credited to Paul and Mel. While John drove his Rolls-Royce to Surrey to a coach company which would paint it in psychedelic colors, Paul had come to the United States, stopping first in San Francisco, where he visited the Haight-Ashbury and met members of the Grateful Dead and Jefferson Airplane. It's Jane's 21st birthday, and Paul, who'd present her an engagement ring that December, had promised to celebrate with her. He would attend a performance of Romeo and Juliet and lead the audience in a standing ovation. Jane had been acting since age 5, and her career ambitions, along with an episode in which she found Paul with another woman, would lead to a breakup in 1968. But for now, they were, in the eyes of Beatle fans, the perfect couple. In the Rocky Mountains outside Denver, Paul captures the surrounding beauty, including Jane, and, well, why not, his own feet. But a Beatle is rarely alone. Even while he's having his mini vacation with Jane, Paul is tracked by Mel Evans. Actually, it's one of his jobs. Mel, who met the Beatles in 1961 at the Cavern Club in Liverpool, where he was a bouncer, is the Beatles' bodyguard as well as their road manager. On his way over from London, Paul came up with the idea of a TV film he might direct himself. Now he's getting in a little practice behind the camera. In Denver, Paul aimed his camera at anything that either moved or didn't. Where he and Jane stayed, a surprisingly modest motel probably booked by the Old Vic for her, and the surrounding neighborhood. Derek Taylor, the Beatles' publicist, told me that all the Beatles loved the latest gadgets. Paul was clearly inseparable from his. While a yellow cabbie drove, Paul continued his cinematic explorations around town. In most of his visits to America as a Beatle, Paul had seen little more than airports, auditoriums, and stadiums, and hotel rooms, of course. As he told me once, it's like any kind of tour. You just scoot through. You see the hall you're playing in and a little of the outside scenery, unless you stay for a while. Tours get to be a bit of a blur. At an early press conference with the Beatles, someone asked, "What do you do when you're cooped up in a hotel room between shows?" And George Harrison responded, "We ice skate." Anyway, this visit with Jane was a rare opportunity for Paul to see and capture the sights of a typical American city. Paul lapped up everything his camera could get into focus, from architecture to things he found amusing. Outdoor signs, cornball decorations, garish outsized advertising, things Americans had taken for granted, but which to him were still novel. In their 3-day visit, Paul and Jane visited the Red Rocks Amphitheater. For Paul, it was a homecoming of sorts. The Beatles played there in the summer of 1964 at one early height of Beatlemania, to 9,000 screaming fans, many of them pelting the stage with jelly beans. After Paul showed Jane around, they parted ways, Jane continuing on her 3-month tour with the Old Vic Company, and Paul opening himself up to the world capital of movie-making itself. Although Paul was supposed to be on vacation, he stayed busy in Los Angeles. He visited a Beach Boys recording session and helped produce the song Vegetables. Paul has been quoted saying that he wrote Here, There, and Everywhere with the Beach Boys in mind. But of course, the Beatles performed the song with John and George playing Beach Boys in June of 1966 for their album Revolver. Paul and Mel stayed with Derek Taylor, who had been the Beatles' publicist in London and now lived with his wife Joan and their 2 daughters in the Hollywood Hills. Derek now represented the cream of Los Angeles pop groups, and he invited Paul to join the board of directors of the upcoming Monterey Pop Festival. Derek is grateful that Paul had his movie camera with him. His own films during these times were stolen years later when someone broke into his car thinking it carried films of the Beatles. Now Derek has happily added this footage to his family archives. Neither Derek nor Paul was dressed for poolside lounging, but you can see that Paul's been to Carnaby Row in London and that he's a dedicated follower of fashion. Well, Derek Taylor booked a babysitter, and he and Paul drove off to check out the new Century City complex just past Beverly Hills, where prices, of course, are always reasonable. In public, Derek remembers Paul was at ease, but he moved very quickly so that people might see him, but before they had much time to do anything about it, he was gone. Once settled somewhere, he found it easy to relax, and after browsing, he and Derek slipped into a bar for a cocktail. After agreeing to join the Monterey Pop Festival board, Paul was off to London. On the aircraft, he began sketching out specific ideas, even for songs and cast members for his TV film, something about a mystery tour. Paul's idea for Magical Mystery Tour came in part from his visit to San Francisco that spring of 1967. He met some of the local bands and heard about the novelist Ken Kesey's Merry Pranksters, who traveled the West Coast in their psychedelically painted bus, taping and filming their exploits. And, as he told Paul Gambaccini in Rolling Stone magazine, in England they have these things called mystery tours, and you go on them, and you pay so much, and you don't know where you're going. Paul would come up with his own magic bus, traversing the British seaside, filming whatever happened. John Lennon called it the most expensive home movie ever made. He said he and the others were just going along with Paul's notion for a television film, but once they got into it, they got into it. John even directed a scene. Ringo took a lead role, and George contributed a song, Blue Jay Way, to the soundtrack. After recording a few tracks in August and September, the Beatles and a cast and crew of 43 took off in the freshly painted Magical Mystery Tour bus to begin filming. Here, by way of Mel's movie camera, we see them in the Cornish resort of Newquay on the Atlantic coast. Although it's obviously cold and windy, there are a number of young women in bikinis. That's because they're working on a scene in which Happy Nat, the rubber man, is chasing young women around an outdoor swimming pool and then up the cliffs in Holywell, just south of Newquay. It took 2 days to reach the Atlantic coast by coach, and although the Beatles' travels were supposedly secret, fans all along their route caught wind of a Magical Mystery Tour. In Devon, 183 miles outside of London, 400 teenagers heard that the Beatles were on their way, and they braved a fierce rain to greet the group. In Newquay, while assistants kept them from screaming, the fans waited and watched and were rewarded with glimpses of all the Beatles. And at least one Beatle didn't seem to mind the attention. After the film came out, the Beatles admitted that by and large, not much happened that was magical. It was obvious that their inexperience in making a movie on their own had hurt. "I suppose," said Paul, "if you look at it from the point of view of good Boxing Day entertainment, we goofed, really." But Paul declared himself somewhat less than intimidated by his first time out behind the lenses. "It was really just like making a record album," he said. "We just got a lot of things ready and fitted them together. A record is sound and a film is visual. That's the only difference. In the future, all records will have vision as well as sound. In 20 years' time, people will be amazed to think we just listened to records." Although stung by the critics, Paul expressed pride that, in the face of the death of Brian Epstein, the band had hung together and succeeded in completing a major project. There had actually been a magical mystery tour. Paul insisted that he was looking forward to making another movie with the Beatles. "You've got to be patient," he said. "I think it was a good show. It will have its day." It was a good show while it lasted. Now let's step back a few months and hit the road with Paul and Mel in Spain and Africa. It's October of 1966, and the Beatles have finished their U.S. tour, wrapping it up in August at Candlestick Park in San Francisco. Unbeknownst to the world, it was their last show. The band itself, although wary of Beatlemania, of doing their concerts by rote, wasn't sure. All John, George, Ringo, and Paul knew was that they were exhausted and needed a break. George went to India to study yoga, the musical instrument the sitar, and Indian philosophy. John had a role in Richard Lester's first film after Help. It was called How I Won the War, and filmed in West Germany and in Almeria, in southern Spain just across the Mediterranean Sea from Algeria. Ringo spent time in Surrey with his family and took a holiday in Spain, visiting John on the movie set. Paul wrote the score for a Haley Mills movie, The Family Way. Afterwards, thinking that he too could catch John on location, and taken by surprise, he and Mel Evans drove from France into Spain. But the surprise was on Paul. John had finished his role and returned to London, leaving Paul with some time on his hands before he was due back in the studios. "Well, let's just continue on," he told Mel. He'd heard of a relatively new phenomenon, photographic safaris in Africa. They would fly to Kenya, but before doing so, they spent a few days motoring along the Spanish coastline. Both Paul and Mel made silent but expressive, far away from home movies. Traveling by jeep, Paul and Mel Evans soaked up the countryside. In his album Ram, Paul wrote about a dog of his that had 3 legs but couldn't run. Let's see here. 1, 2, 3, 4. Nah, wrong dog. Almeria, where John had worked in his war movie, is on the southeast coast of Spain. It's a town of tree-lined boulevards and town squares that boast beautiful gardens. Just north is San Jose, a village close to near-deserted beaches that offer luminous skies and spectacular vistas. On their way to Almeria, Paul and Mel found sand dunes stretching all the way from Alicante down to the rocky coves of the Costa Blanca. This, as most Beatle fans know, was not Paul's first time in Spain. With the Beatles, he played concerts in Spain in 1965. The dates were July 2nd in Madrid at the Plaza de Toros de Madrid, Plaza de Toros meaning bull ring, and July 3rd at the Plaza de Toros in Barcelona. Paul and Mel were part of the tourist boom that helped pick up Spain's economy, which had been in disarray since the Spanish Civil War, which decimated the country from 1936 to 1939. and by the dictatorship of General Francisco Franco. Although Paul encountered a Spain trapped in a peasant economy and a people still awaiting the Spanish miracle that followed Franco's death and Spain's emergence into democracy and capitalism, he found the people open and engaging. In towns all along the coastline, Paul and Mel would find plazas and buildings whose architecture evoked the days of the Moors. In Almeria itself, the dominant site is the Alcazaba Fortress, and below that is a cathedral whose towers give it the look of a castle. Rebuilt after an earthquake in the 1520s, the Plaza de la Catedral has a statue of San Indalecio, the town's patron saint. Here's Big Mel, as he was known in Beatle circles, just wandering around in a courtyard, quickly drawing attention from some local children. Before meeting the Beatles at the Cavern Club in Liverpool, Mel was a telephone repairman. He began working with the band when he took over one night as a driver to take the Beatles to London for a radio interview. From that time on, he was with the group until its end. Free to roam the Spanish countryside, Paul and Mel dropped in on a farm near their motel and got a chance to see how the natives lived. Paul by now had a 5-story Victorian house in St. John's Wood, a house Jane Asher found for him. She also encouraged him to acquire a farm in Scotland as a retreat for them. Despite the peace they found at High Park Farm, they broke up in 1968. They remained friends, and Jane continued to act on stage, on television, and on film. From southern Spain, Paul and Mel flew to Nairobi, Kenya. There they joined a photo safari. Paul's safari would stay with him, and as with so many of his experiences in life, inspire him musically. 5 years later, in 1971, in Wildlife, the first album he'd make with Wings, he'd write and sing about taking a walk through an African park one day and seeing a sign saying that animals had the right of way. Whatever happened, he asks repeatedly, to wildlife? Rolling Stone magazine sniped at Wildlife, calling the lyrics very clumsy things to say in what sounds like a too obvious to be real, ecology fad-inspired song. Paul admitted about the album that you have to like me to like the record. If it's just taken cold, I think it wasn't that brilliant as a recording. We did it in about 2 weeks, the whole thing. The rushed schedule, Paul told me once, was inspired by Bob Dylan. Dylan, he had heard, had done an album in a week. Also, he said, John had made Imagine in about 2 weeks, so why not Paul? Paul said he didn't mind that Wildlife got negative criticism and didn't do as well as most of his records. One day, he remembers, he was walking along Sunset Strip in Los Angeles when a long-haired young man in a van called out to him. He held up a copy of the album. "Hey, I'm going to the mountains and I'm taking this with me. It's your best album," he told Paul. So take that, Rolling Stone. A year after the Wildlife album, Paul found himself back in Africa again, this time to cut a Wings record, Band on the Run. It was late 1972, and they were using Ginger Baker's studio in Lagos, in Nigeria, in north-central Africa. Paul says he went to Paris and Nigeria for the album, just for the fun, just to come somewhere different for a different type of turn-on, that's all. In Lagos, McCartney and his band ran into some hostility from Fela Ransome Kuti, the Afrobeat musician who was part of Ginger Baker's band, the Air Force. As Paul recalls, old Fela thought, "Hello, why have they come to Lagos?" And the only reason he could think of was that we must be stealing black music, black African music, the Lagos sound. So I said, "Do us a favor, we do okay as it is, we're not pinching your music." As Paul put it, they felt they have their own little ethnic thing going, and these big foreigners are taking all their bit and beating them back to the West with it, because they have a lot of difficulty getting their sound heard in the West. And they are brilliant. It's incredible music down there. I think it will come to the fore. When I heard Fela Ransome Kuti the first time, it made me cry. It was that good. Here's Mel Evans taking a turn at handling a snake. Paul stays safely behind his camera. Even in Kenya, Paul finds himself the hunted as well as the hunter. Here's a fellow passenger on a bus who takes a few moments to realize that there's a beetle aboard. Once she does something about it. Calmly, but she does. After all, it wouldn't do to just tell friends that she had run into Paul McCartney while on safari. She needs some evidence. And so it's farewell to Africa and to holiday. In London, a new album project awaits. The Beatles aren't sure what it'll be, and they don't know what 1967 holds in store. They have no inkling that someone named Sergeant Pepper is soon to enter and change their lives. At this moment, it's just the end of another day in the life. For the Mystery Trip, this is Ben Fong Torres.